It's no longer labeled a law against religious separatism, and you won't find in it the words radical Islam. But, as Emmanuel Macron's justice minister openly states, it's abundantly clear that between the lines, the French government's much-anticipated law for Republican principles is precisely about what this nation can no longer endure. After 5 years of a steady stream of terror attacks, capped most recently by the gruesome beheading of middle school social studies teacher Samuel Paty, we're going to be asking about a draft bill that tackles illegal schools, foreign imams, forced marriages, even homeschooling for 3-year-olds. Is it too much or not enough? For some, the legislation's an overdue stating of the obvious, affirming secular values. The law of the Republic is above any one religion. For others, it's a radicalization in its own right, the elevation of laïcité, that French notion of secularism, into holy sacrament that leaves no room for discussion. Is the French left correct in objecting to the notion of Islamo-leftism? Or more recently, the Trump administration, which is openly worrying about freedom of worship in France. If Macron's wrong, how do you take on radical Islam? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about French secularism and Macron's Republican Principles Bill. Joining us from Brussels, Sandro Gozzi, member of the European Parliament from the French president's La République En Marche party. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting.
From Toulouse in southwestern France, Rimsala Alouane, researcher in public law at the University of Toulouse Capitole. Your work focusing on religious freedom and constitutional law. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
And from the French capital, James Macaulay, Paris correspondent for The Washington Post. You penned an op-ed piece in French broadsheet Le Monde this past Saturday entitled "We're Scared for the Future of the French Ideal of Universal Values." We'll talk a bit more about that. Thanks for being with us, James.
Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now, this bill's gone through several rewrites since Emmanuel Macron first laid out its principles in an October 2nd speech. More from Monty Francis.
Once called a law on separatism, French Prime Minister Jean Castex unveiled Wednesday a law to reinforce Republican values, legislation targeting radical Islam.
Le travail de sape que je viens de décrire est bien souvent le fait d'une idéologie pernicieuse portant le nom d'islamisme radical. Cette idéologie a pour objectif de diviser les uns et les autres et de répandre dans la société la haine et la violence.
Castex, along with cabinet members, insisted that the bill does not target Islam as a religion nor Muslims as a whole.
Mesdames et messieurs, c'est rappeler la liberté. Et protéger les valeurs de la République, c'est protéger la liberté.
The bill's 57 articles have changed a lot since Macron first introduced the measures back in October. Since then, there have been 3 attacks: an attack near the former offices of Charlie Hebdo, the assassination of schoolteacher Samuel Paty, and the attack at a church in Nice. As a result of Paty's murder, the bill addresses hatred and privacy online. The law would also force private schools to teach so-called French Republican values and would ban homeschooling for very young children unless there is authorization from the state. Also sparking controversy, the oversight of religious practices. It requires oversight of a mosque's finances and the training of imams. It also gives the government the power to inspect them and to shut them down if they're found to be promoting extremism. Critics in the Muslim world say it singles out Islam. It has also prompted some scathing international criticism of Macron, particularly from English-speaking media in England and the U.S., with claims the bill would drive societal divisions even deeper. The French Parliament is expected to open what is likely to be a lively debate on the draft law in January.
Sandro Gozzi, is this bill in the spirit of, again, those universal values that France touts?
In my view, absolutely. Universal values based on unity of the Republic, based on a secular republic. It's Article 1 of the Constitution, which states that the French Republic is united and is secular. And also a bill that wants to preserve the freedom of everybody, for the freedom of those who believe, those who do not believe. But certainly is a law which restate the values which a victim like Samuel Paty was witnessing every day at school. You must be free to express your own belief. You must be free also to make a satirical comments. I mean, there is a freedom of also caricature that we cannot like. And I think that it is a law which is in the interest of all the citizens. First of all, in the interest of citizens whose belief is Islam, because the political and the terrorist use, manipulation of a religion, I mean, goes against the principle of the Republic, but goes against mainly the main victim, the first victim in the world, but also in France politically, are the vast majority, I mean, of the French residents or French citizens who believe in Islam, who are those who are mainly manipulated by this political use of Islamism. So I think it is an answer fully consistent with the principle of the Republic and necessary in a country that only in the last 4 years has had every year an average of 5-7 attacks motivated by political Islamism, motivated by radical Islamism. Only in 2020 we have got 7 attacks, and we have to protect those who at school, in the public sphere, they are there to witness and to practice and to implement the principle of the French Republic. Unfortunately, Samuel Paty was a victim of those who hate this principle, and also it is in this memory, in my view, that we have to present this new bill.
Rim Sarah Alouane, is this a bill that is in the spirit of Samuel Paty? Do you agree with Sandro Gozzi?
Well, I find it fascinating that every time we go through those horrific terrorist attacks, the first idea of the government is to rethink our management of state and religion instead of looking at our failures to prevent terrorism. First, we see how tricky it is. The title has changed how many times now? 4 times, just to show you how problematic even the wording used is very difficult, you know, since, for example, first it was separatism. What does separatism mean? In law, it doesn't mean much. Then it was strengthening laicity and the values of the Republic. The problem is the law of 1905 is pretty clear, and today we celebrate its 115th anniversary. The state should not interfere with religious affairs, and vice versa. Churches, religion should not interfere with state affairs. But what I was saying here in that draft is more involvement of the state in state affairs. So in the first view, the bill seems innocent, but the devil is really in the details. Just for your information, the bill has been submitted to the Council of State for an opinion, and the Council of State released its opinion 2 days ago, gave its green light, but also put some reservation, especially regarding homeschooling. Will most likely backpedal because I suspect that a few of these proposals are violating the European Convention as well as the European Charter of Human Rights. And unfortunately, what we are seeing here is what I call the weaponization of laicity. Since we still consider the Muslim population as unable to integrate, as a population we need to tame, we always use these excuses to modify the law of 1905. And in the end, I think we are not respecting the essence of this beautiful law that aims to protect religious freedom and freedom of conscience. And I think the best way to honor Samuel Paty is to show that we are still a country that respects laïcité, that we are a country that promotes freedom of expression, freedom of thoughts, instead of using his murder as an excuse to curtail more civil liberties.
How does it curb freedom of thought, this bill?
Well, it's really the debate around the whole separatism thing. We confuse everything during the debate. And by the way, most of what have been discussed in the media or between politicians are not even in the bill, because none of this proposal would have survived a constitutional test. But, you know, everybody talk about political Islam without even defining it. So we confuse everything. There is a huge brouhaha. So for some, ethnic food aisle are a cause of separatism. Those are the words of our interior minister. For some, Islamo-leftism is spreading into academia and cause separatism. These are the words of our Minister of Education. The wearing of a hijab is a potential sign of separatism, and hence of radicalization and eventually of terrorism. These are the words of many in the left, in the right, and in the far right. So it's this confusion, this brouhaha that people feel that, and it's a one-sided debate. Usually Muslims are not even invited to take part of this debate. It's one-sided, it's confusing, and the vagueness allowed to open this Pandora box and pass certain laws that actually will be dangerous for civil liberties.
All right. The French Justice Minister was asked by radio station France Inter why the words radical Islam weren't in the final draft. Let's listen to Éric Dupond-Moretti.
First of all, I dare say it's between all the lines of the bill. It is in all the punctuation of the bill. But when one evokes separation, there is not only radical Islam, there are other things. And the idea for sure is not to be too restrictive, even if, of course, this bill essentially targets radical Islam.
So, James Macaulay, you just heard the Justice Minister. Before that, you heard Sandro Gozzi make the argument that this is a bill that is inclusive for France's Muslim community, the largest in Europe, by the way. And you heard the opposite claim from Rym talking about how it weaponizes laïcité, secularism. What are your thoughts when you hear the Justice Minister there?
I think it's a really interesting moment, what we are witnessing in France at this instant, largely because, I think that the question of words and language is crucial and, in fact, central to this whole discussion. So which words are used, which words are not used, that is essentially what this whole sort of struggle is about at this point. And I think that the reason it's important and the reason it's worth thinking about in greater depth is that, so the notion that the word Islamism is no longer in the text of the law. And we learned from an advisor to Macron today that the reason for that is that the project is more on a kind of broader level about defending Republican values and not necessarily just specifically tied to this one particular issue. But I do think it's interesting, though, in that Islamism, and Rym Sarad just pointed this out, it has any number of different definitions depending on whom you ask. And that, in fact, is the problem, it seems to me. There is, just from my observation as a reporter working on this topic, there does seem to be quite a lot of confusion among French citizens and even French elites and political elites about the difference between what is the legitimate practice of Islam, the religion, which has deep historic roots in France, as we all know, and as you mentioned, France is home to the largest Muslim community in Europe, and the sort of radical Islamist separatist tendency. I mean, even there, it's difficult to describe exactly what to call the problem. But anyway, radical Islamist violence that leads to terrorism, as we have seen in these recent horrific attacks. The public statements, and Rym Sarad mentioned some of these that we have heard, have sort of added confusion. So, the comment about halal meat and in supermarkets, the notion of Islamo-gauchism, Islamo-leftism in French universities. I mean, there are that suggests that that eating halal, for instance, that's just the practice, that's just the observance of a major world religion. It has nothing to do with withdrawing from the national community necessarily. So I think that the issue is really that semantic issue is sort of right at the heart of the problem, which is that it's really impossible to say for so many people where the line is. And at least a lot of the Muslim faith leaders that I have spoken to, including many of those who support the government's quest against separatism and the violence that it can create, as evidence. But there was a brilliant open letter in Le Monde signed by many of these faith leaders and prominent intellectuals. When you ask them in greater depth about what they actually think about the rhetoric surrounding the debate, they say the same, which is that they feel as though even though there is a security issue at play.
There's a bit of confusion, you're saying. James, I'm going to have to cut you off very briefly. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the anniversary date, as Rimsa Alouane was mentioning, of France's 1905 law on separation of religion and state, the one that was not a coincidence when the government decided to unveil its Republican Principles Bill, which is aimed at radical Islam. We're talking about it with Sandro Gozzi, member of the European Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Thank you for joining us from Brussels. Thanks to Rimsa Alouane, who is with the University of Toulouse Capitale, for being with us from the southwestern city in France, and the Paris correspondent for the Washington Post, James Macaulay, with us as well just before the break. James mentioning how there's been a lot of resentment in left-wing circles over that term, Islamo-leftism. There's also been blowback from other academics. The real threat is the persistence of denial, warned some 100 university scholars. This in an open letter they published recently in French newspaper Le Monde. They denounce in their midst communiques that are too timid, they say, in denouncing radical Islam in the wake of Samuel Paty's assassination. And James, they go on to say the import of sectarian Anglo-Saxon ideologies, intellectual conformism, fear, and political correctness are a genuine threat to our universities. Your reaction?
Well, first of all, I would say that I'm always amused by the embrace of this term Anglo-Saxon to describe actually what, I do not know, but usually it seems to me to describe Britain and the United States, countries that, at least in Britain's case, may have had this particular history, but in ours, it's hard to find those who are either Anglo or Saxon or both. Anyway, I think that, look, like the tradition of anti-Americanism in France is quite strong, and it's easy to identify a sort of foreign threat in this manner than to, I think, perhaps interrogate some of the root causes of the phenomenon. I respect entirely what they may point out in their own sort of lived experiences, but I do think that, and then there have been other letters in Le Monde sort of responding. I do think, though, that proposing amendments that that in some ways would restrict research capabilities in these sort of vaunted and prominent French universities raises questions about freedom of expression, et cetera, precisely at the moment when France has positioned itself as a leading champion of free expression on the world stage.
Is there too much use of this term Islamo-leftism, Sandro Gozzi?
Well, I really don't care about Islamolefticism, but I don't find neither interesting nor fascinating what we are talking about differently from the other interlocutors. The expression Islamoleftism doesn't interest me at all. What it interests me is to strengthen the law of 1905. And I tell you in a very simple way. Everybody in France must understand that the Constitution, the French Constitution, or the European Convention of Human Rights, or the EU Charter of Human Rights are above any religious text. That they prevail on the Bible, they prevail on the Torah, and they prevail on the Quran too. And unfortunately, this is not fully clear to everybody, and I think we have to make clear. I mean, we had to introduce a law because in France, as elsewhere also, but in France, we know that certificate of virginity are still asked to young girls before to get married. This is unacceptable. Not only, so I want to reassure, there is any anti-Americanism. This is unacceptable under EU values, not only under French values. To draw a distinction in an heritage between heirs and to give more to the male heir instead of the female heir, as it happens in France, violating the law of the French Republic, is unacceptable.
But Sandro, let me ask you about this. Sandro,
to continue to have forced marriage in the European Union is unacceptable. Okay? And we have to fight against this in the interest of everybody. So I don't know if this is anti-Americanism. I don't give a damn whether this is anti-Americanism. I don't think so. This is to fight for the French and EU fundamental values.
Francois, may I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So this is a question for Sandro. I'm very interested in your in what you just said, but my question is, and again, I come at this from the perspective of a historian, but why does the existing law of 1905, which is a remarkable piece of legislation, very modern, ahead of its time in many ways, why does it need to be strengthened? I mean, in my mind, isn't all of this already there? Consider, for instance, Article 31 of the law of 1905, which essentially is a provision that, in my mind, reading the actual text, would prevent the same sort of separatism that the current recasting aspires to do. So, I mean, why? You mentioned that there are all these problems, which of course we all see them, but doesn't France already have the legal means to combat them? And then the question becomes about enforcement rather than sort of recasting the law.
Sandro Gozzi?
On the problem that I mentioned, no. On the problem that I mentioned, you need to be very clear with the new legislation. On the problem that I mentioned, like forced marriage, like discrimination between heirs, like virginity certificate. On the 1905 law, first of all, you have to encourage and to make sure that it's much more used when it comes to religious activities. And you know that today there is a wider use of the law on the association of 1901 when we want to encourage, as it is a question of religious activities, the law of 1905. The second point is there is a new problem, for example. I give you only an example. The new problem is to ensure transparency of the funding to religious communities. And we know that we need to be more demanding to ensure that the criteria of funding are much more transparent, and this is something that it wasn't a problem in 1905. It has become a problem today, so we need to strengthen also that aspect. So you see, I agree with you. The law of 1905 is certainly a fundamental law, and it is still valid under many aspects, but we know in the light of the recent experiences that on one side, the implementation of this law must be encouraged, when it matters to religious communities, activities. On the other side, there are some aspects, like transparency of the funding, that need to be strengthened. And I think that these are the objectives that are pursued. And in my view, we shouldn't be worried about that, because they are objective and principle which go in the interest of those who want to use the law.
All right, let me bring in Rimsar Alwan on this. Let's go into the specifics here about this bill. Do we need to legislate on illegal schools, weeding out, having fewer and fewer foreign imams, which I know has been a particular bone of contention with Turkey and Emmanuel Macron, trying to crack down on forced marriages, and again, this idea of keeping a closer eye on homeschooling. Do you need to legislate on those matters?
Couple of things. First, it's a French national sport to adopt new pieces of legislation every time there is a problem. But instead of finding to a disease, we just put a band-aid and add laws and more laws and more laws. As we say in French, we are not inventing hot water. On n'invente pas l'eau chaude. There are already laws regarding these issues. But, you know, when such horrific events occurred, you need to show that you are doing something. So I think we are all in like the political performance arena. Second, you know, like every time there is a terrorist attack, like I said previously, we add new legislation. So, for example, in 2015, after Charlie Hebdo, we went through a state of emergency that lasted for 2 years. After that, we adopted a law on interior security and fight against terrorism that basically, to make it simple, made many features of state of emergency laws into permanent law. So it is already a very, very strong legal framework, probably one of the strongest in Western Europe. And despite all of this, we still have terrorist attack. And my question is really, when you look at the profile of those terrorists, when you read serious studies and don't listen really to pundits on certain networks, most of those terrorists did not receive a religious education, never attend a mosque, and actually are part of an underground transnational movement and find basically their information to reinforce ideas online with group of friends. So my question is, if we pass more laws, if we shut down mosques, really the question is it going to stop extremism? Really? Are we actually doing something about it?
But in the case of Samuel Paty, which is the one that's captured the country's imagination, Rimsar Alwan, we know that one of the things that really shocked public opinion was the fact that his personal details were outed on the Facebook page of a mosque in the Paris area.
Yes, and absolutely, it's doxing, and I think doxing should be addressed. And unfortunately, many associations, many organizations tried to call out the government on these issues. And besides Samuel Paty, unfortunately, we saw the consequences. But I'm more talking in general. It sounds like every time such attacks are occurring, we don't see what went wrong with all the instruments, the legal tools we already have. Why it didn't work? That man was reported last summer on Pharos, this platform run by the police when we can report potential criminal Twitter accounts, for example, and nothing has been done. Why? And to respond to your question to foreign imams, I absolutely agree. We need to stop what we call consulate Islam. We are the country that basically put into place that kind of framework. And it's caused issue. Yes, you cannot pretend to want an Islam of France by still importing imams who don't speak French, who don't know the French culture. I agree. However, I think that the state should not interfere. It really has to come Now, can the state help? Why not? Try to empower? Sure. But it really has to come from the ground. Otherwise, all we have is, again, the state trying to organize religion.
Sarah Alouane, what do you do with a religion like Islam, which is not like the Catholic Church, which is top down, but where it is very decentralized? How do you do that?
Like I said, it has to come from the community. So we do have there are in France representation of Islam. For example, the Conseil français du culte musulman, who is not even seen as legitimate by many Muslims in this country because they are deemed too close to the government. So really, I think we need to be more creative, to find ways, maybe getting inspired by our neighbors, or why not, maybe even across the Atlantic, to find a way to really make imams independent, to make also, try to avoid foreign funding. And actually, there was a report by the Senate a couple of years ago regarding the funding of Islam in France. And the truth is, except for the funding of big projects, most of the funding come from the people, even though it's harsher and harsher. But I think we need to be more open. We need to find alternative. And I think we maybe need to discuss with our European neighbors and find a common way to find a way. So we can, for example, use what Germany did. They started an open conversation with the Muslim communities to find common ground to build a system that would prevent foreign interference. We can be inspired by what happened, I'm going to say a bad word, in America, where you have program of chaplaincy implemented at university. Yes, but you need to have a will for that, and I'm not sure it exists right now.
Sandro Gozzi, do you agree that more can be done following the example of other nations to create that dialogue?
Well, I mean, you know, looking at my history, I mean, of course, I always want to learn lessons from other countries because I think that there is always to learn. I really don't understand this tonight. We got the impression that the law on the Republican principle is a law against America. I mean, there's always this sarcasm about the French debate on the United States. I mean, I really don't, I'm very far from this.
All right, let me ask you, Sandro, on that point.
Religion, do we want, yes.
Let me ask you on that point, because Donald Trump's ambassador at large for international religious freedom spoke on Tuesday. He's the former governor of Kansas. His name is Sam Brownback, and he told reporters, "I'm concerned, obviously, for what's happening in France. There can be constructive engagements that I think can be helpful and not harmful. When you get heavy-handed, the situation can get worse." End quote. Your reaction when you hear that from across the Atlantic?
Then in the Republic we trust, I would answer to the French American ambassador, or very soon, hope former American ambassador. In France, we think that we have to fully respect the principle of the secular republic. Even in the United States, it's based on another model, but I don't see any danger for the fundamental freedom in France. I think France at the forefront of the fight for rule of law and fundamental freedom, not only in France, but also in Europe and outside Europe. Talking about, so I mean, really, our American friends, they don't have to worry at all for the respect of rule of law and fundamental freedoms in France. Maybe they should worry about the respect of this principle in countries which are our and their allies, like Turkey or like Poland and Hungary, to remain in the European Union. These are the countries on which also our American friends should worry a little bit more instead of France. But coming back to the issue of the imam as teacher, I mean, it is clear, you cannot think that you ensure that the religious practices are in the full respect of the law of the Republic if the imam who teaches those principles does not speak French, does not know the doesn't know the French Constitution. Let me add, doesn't know even the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. If it's financed by foreign powers who wants to nurture a certain radical approach of Islam. I mean, this is what is happening. And then we shouldn't be naive. And we have to give an answer to this problem. I mean, nobody wants to control the contribution of the single believers to the mosque. But when the financing are very high, beyond the 10,000 euro, for example, which as a contribution for a mosque is already pretty high, we ask that those financial flows are made transparent. It is nothing against the mosque. It is for the sake of transparency in the public sphere. So also from this perspective, I would get out of the stereotypes, and I would take stock that, I mean, there is a need for a new legislation because there are new problems that have been unsolved in the past, and that requires also a legislative answer. Not only a legislative answer, I agree from what was saying, let's work on education, let's work on civic commitment, let's engage with the communities. But I mean, this law doesn't prevent this. This law doesn't prevent a stronger engagement with the Muslim communities. This law doesn't prevent a stronger role of education in the public school. On the contrary, this law wants to make sure that free education in the full respect of the French Republic can be practiced in the French school without being threatened of being killed or without being beheaded, as it happens to Emmanuel Macron, because he practices the teaching of a secular republic and talk about caricatures and freedom of expression. These are the issue.
Let me bring in James Macaulay on this.
Not only a legislative answer, but also a legislative answer together with education and together with mutual engagement and dialogue.
Let me bring in James Macaulay on this, because in that piece that you penned for Le Monde, you said that some of your American colleagues aren't fully conscious of just how much France has endured these past 5 years. And you conclude by saying that actually the values of the Republic here and the values of the Republic in the U.S. have the same roots.
Yes, I very much believe that. I think that, there's a reason that France and the United States are called the sister republics. It's because of this sort of common, a history that, yes, has some very important differences, but also, common roots in the sort of Enlightenment theory that you mentioned. And, on that, I think that Sandro is absolutely right to point out the hypocrisy of the State Department comment earlier this week. I mean, this is the administration that brought you the Muslim ban, let's not forget. But that being said, the larger point that a universal society can tolerate religious difference, and in fact always has, seems to be the issue. And I think there seems to be I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's deliberate or sort of just it happens inevitably over time, but there seems to be a lack of sort of understanding of the fact that, in fact, French history shows very clearly space for legitimate observance of religious belief. And so when you have, this is part of the issue with the debate around the phrase Islamism today, which is, I think, obviously, all of the horrible terror attacks that we have all lived through in France in these past 5 years, they show that there is a problem. But the problem is not the consumption of halal meat or the marketing of halal meat in supermarkets. I mean, see, this is the difference. France has always been a country in which one can observe one's religion. That is, in fact, the genius of 1905. It's not just the freedom not to believe, it is also the freedom to believe. And there's a long and beautiful history of that in this country. And I think that is part of the problem that we're seeing now. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what laïcité actually is.
All right. And it's definitely one that we will continue to follow. So much more to talk about. Unfortunately, we're short on time. James Macaulay, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank as well Rim Sarah Alwan, Sandro Gozzi, in Brussels. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.